Recording in progress. Recording stopped. Recording in progress.
Hi, everyone. My name is Caitlin Edwards, and I'm the Community Events Manager at Linux Professional Institute. For those of you new to Linux Professional Institute, our mission is to promote the use of open source by supporting the people that work within it. LPI is the global certification standard and career support organization for open source professionals. With more than 200,000 certification holders, we are the world's first and largest vendor-neutral Linux and open source certification body. We have certified professionals in over 180 countries, deliver exams in multiple languages, and have hundreds of training partners. Thank you for joining us today at our webinar, The P in LPI, What It Means to Be an Open Source Professional. Our presenter, Evan Leibovich, will outline why ethics and soft skills matter to LPI, why ethics and soft skills should matter to you, LPI's initiatives to promote professional conduct and personal development, and what's inside LPI's code of conduct. During the webinar, we encourage questions, so feel free to ask your questions using the Q&A or the chat box at the bottom of your screen, submitting questions publicly or privately. I will track and facilitate throughout the webinar. This webinar will be recorded, and the recording and the slides will be sent out to everyone earlier next week. As mentioned, today's webinar will be led by Evan Leibovich. Evan is one of the co-founders of LPI going back to 1999 and was the lead in drafting our current code of conduct. He was its first board chair and helped grow the organization worldwide. He is involved in our community engagement team, still making new friends and partners around the world, and based in Toronto, Canada. Evan, please take it away.
Thanks so much, Caitlin, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are and whenever you're watching this. Thanks for joining us, and I'm glad to have you with us. So getting right into things, I just want to go a little bit more into LPI, just as a reminder that we've been around for more than 20 years. We've certified more than 200,000 professionals, and we're operating pretty well globally, worldwide. And the reason I mention this is, as part of this conversation, to talk about the unique role that LPI has in the open source ecosystem. We're more than an organization that just does certification. And I want to spend some time going into that. And again, why we have the word professional in the name of the organization. So just going a little bit into the concept of what is an open source professional. Well, we already know about the tech skills. We do certification. It's something that we've been doing since we started. We do certification, but we know that certification isn't enough to advance your career. It's not enough to help realize what you want to get out of this. You're going to be working in organizations. You're going to be working with communities of people. You're going to be participating in mailing lists and dealing with other people. And so knowing just the tech skills without having any of those other skills is going to impair your career advancement. And along with that, the ethics do matter. The idea of dealing with what's right and what's wrong, it does have consequences, and it's something that matters to us as an organization. And so, well, the whole ethics of why open source. You're here and you're working with open source in part because of ethical reasons. The idea of working with open source, it's good for you. It helps your career. It builds on the strength of others. By the definition, you working with open source means you have access to the source code and the works of others. Similarly, the people that follow you will have access to the work that you've done. And the result of that is an unmatched world of software that's out there. But in order to do that, you've had people collaborating with each other and people that have to work together. Working with open source is good for your career. The world runs on open source, literally. Everything from small embedded systems in cars and appliances that you never look at, to Raspberry Pis, to PCs, to servers, to the cloud, to the biggest supercomputers in the world. The world runs on Linux, with the exception of business desktops. Linux is predominant and BSD is predominant just about everywhere. And so this is why a lot of your job prospects really exist in this world. But also for the projects that you do, if you're doing a software project, in much the same way Linus Torvalds said, hey, I'm trying to make this operating system to replace Unix. Does anyone want to join me? And sort of we know where that went. But all sorts of open source projects have started out that way. And by making your project open source, by making it community oriented, you invite a whole world of people to come and help you. And the result of that has been some of the best operating systems, databases, productivity software, and obviously cloud software in the world. It's more secure in the sense that, as Linus once said, you know, when there are enough eyes, all bugs are shallow. When you have open to the source code, you're not doing security through obscurity. You're doing security by actually exposing the software out and letting everybody take a shot at it. And the result of that is simply better code. And so these are all reasons to use open source. And a lot of these boil down to ethical issues. You're doing things not just because they'll make you more money, but also because it's going to be fun to do and because it's good for you and it's good for the world. And so getting into open source also means understanding more than just I know how to write in my favorite computer language, and so I'm going to go and churn out some code. When you're doing your code, when you're creating your projects, it's also important to understand what is the benefit of using the GPL license as opposed to the BSD license, or many of the dozens of others that exist under the definition of open source. Uh, which one you pick depends on how you want other people to use your work, how you would like them to share, whether you want to force them to share what they've done, and so on. These are important issues that can affect you know, what happens to your project. Also to do with business models. I mean, decades ago, people advanced the idea that it's clear that just because something is open source doesn't mean you can't make money from it. You know, just ask the good folks at Red Hat and SUSE and every other company that right now is doing very good business in making and supporting open source software, and ask them what it's like to know if you can make money from open source. Even the smallest project can benefit from a dual license model, whereas if somebody wants to use the project and the code and they want to use it open source, they have one license, and if they pay you money, they can use a different license. This kind of thing has been used everywhere to help make people money. But again, this is more than just coding. This is understanding the licensing and the structure and the business models about open source. This is part of the soft skills that go beyond simple technical skills and technical certification that help round you out as an individual and make it easier to get that job, make it easier to create that new startup business, that make it easier to create that new project that really attracts a big community. And of course, all of this can be resume builders. They can help you start your own business. It's all part of this. And it's all more than simply the software development, the system admin component of this world. So you can't work in open source without having at least some social skills. And getting along with others in a chat room, in a mailing list, amongst others, is a critical role to making a project go well. If you have, you know, all sorts of arguments and factions and disagreements about even core components of the code, that project's not going anywhere. Now, that's not to say that everyone has to love each other. Some of the best open source projects are ones where you have co-opetition. You know, the famous Ray Noorda phrase that says you can be competing and cooperating at the same time. You just know very clearly where to draw the line between where you're competing and where it's in your interest to work together. But also when you're working within your social environment, you have to consider the fact you don't make fun of people because they don't speak your language or they don't speak the main language of the mailing list or the chat group. Not everyone is going to have either English or the language of the chat as their mother tongue, and that means they're making an effort to talk in your language, and that means you need to cut people slack. You also sometimes have to take account for different time zones. If you want to really attract a worldwide audience, that means you have to be able to work with people who are awake when you're asleep and vice versa. So these are all the kinds of things that when you're trying to build a community and you're trying to build an inclusive community, that you really need to think about. There's governance issues. So who's running things? Is it, one original software creator who presides over everything with an iron fist? Or is it a more egalitarian cooperative thing where everything is done by consensus? One isn't necessarily better than the other, but it's a really good idea if everyone in the group has a clear understanding of what that is, because if there's disagreements or understanding, again, that's going to get in the way of being a successful project. So the culture of the project is going to be an issue that you want to deal with. Understand what the culture is and either be prepared to work with it or convince the other people in your group that it's worthwhile changing. The project culture of Linux is very different from the project culture of BSD. And so you have a number of other things where you can have very similar different kinds of software projects where they accomplish similar aims, but yet their cultural internally is wildly different. I've been to Drupal conferences and I've been to WordPress conferences. Both of those are excellent open source projects, but their internal culture is very, very different. And which one you get involved with may be determined by, not what language they're using, but whether or not you fit in well with the way that they work. And sometimes friction is inevitable. And by here, when I say the F word, I mean forking. And that means when you have a project and there's simply irreconcilable differences that make a subset of the group go off, take a copy of the code as you're entitled to do with open source, and then go and do their own thing. The most famous example I know of that are two projects that started as open source, and then Oracle acquired the governance of them, and you had developers that just weren't prepared to work under that framework, and so they split off. So you had the open office split off into LibreOffice, you had MySQL split off into MariaDB, and there's all sorts of other examples, but those are the two highest profile ones. And they're worth learning from and saying, you try and work with something, you try and work within the framework and within the social structure. But if that doesn't work out for you, open source gives you the freedom with you and other developers or whatever, just to go off, make a snapshot of the project, and then go and start in a different direction. Obviously, forking is less desirable than keeping everyone in one happy family. But if it's not possible, open source allows for this kind of evolution to happen. So again, into the ethics of open source, diversity is key. Try and have a community where you're not doing anything to deliberately shut people out. And that means sometimes being conscious of your language. It sometimes means don't do things that either shut out people from a specific time zone, that aren't good with the language, and make judgments on people based on their names. People you've never met, people may make judgments on them based on their name. I know of one senior kernel developer that said because he had an Asian sounding name, people treated him differently on chat lists merely for that. That's the kind of thing you want to avoid. Judge people for the quality of what they say and the quality of the code they produce, and their willingness to work together with others. The golden rule here is definitely don't be an asshole. And that book that I showed in the previous slide, the No Asshole Rule, I strongly recommend. I'll put a link to it in the notes for this session. And it's really something that some people need to be conscious about being aware of things that you may say unintentionally that will just make your community less inclusive, that will keep people out who may be intimidated and yet may be the strongest contributors to what your project needs. And another thing that's not totally related to this, but it's still very important, and it's to be aware of projects that claim to be open, but are not really open source. And by that, I mean of things like projects such as the Open Core group, which is involved in things they say, you can use it for educational purposes, but if you want to use it for commercial purposes, you have to pay us licensing and so on. You also have some movements that call themselves ethical source, and they say we don't want any, let's say, munitions makers to use our open source code, or we don't want governments we deem to be bad to use our open source code. Well, if that's the case, it's not open source. The fundamentals of both the Free Software Foundation, I believe it's Rule 0, as well as a foundation of the definition of open source, means you cannot limit what people can do with your code. You just cannot put a limit on how it's used. And I understand what people are trying to do and saying this software is under a license that says, you can freely share it, but you can't use it to make weapons. You can't use it to do this. You can't use it to, if that's the case, it may have very laudable intentions, but it's not open source. So be aware of that. And the other thing, and it's sort of related to Open Core, FRAND is not your friend. FRAND stands for fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory. And when you see that in a phrase, if you are into open source, you go running, because that means that they're trying to put all sorts of squishy words onto something that is definitely not open source to try and make it sound friendly. Oh, somebody owns the patents or the copyrights or so on, but they promise to license it in a fair and non-discriminatory way or whatever. But the point is, you still have one organization that's controlling it. You still have them being able to call the shots. And even in something that's supposedly, quote unquote, fair and reasonable and non-discriminatory, gives a lot of leeway to the owner of the code to determine what that is. And so these, again, are all ethical things. It bothers me because some of these are launching themselves as alternatives to open source that are still free and open, and they're really not. I mean, you use your own discretion when looking at that, but just be aware, it's not open source. It's trying to look like it, but it isn't. And so turning the topic a little bit into, what is the role of ethics and LPI? And so this has always been of interest to LPI, which has always focused on the individual working in open source rather than the institutions or companies. And so we care about the professional development of the people that are working in open source. Being involved in open source, it helps develop your career. It helps make you a more rounded person working within open source. And it proves beyond just the technical ability that you're capable of being a participant, indeed a leader within open source. And so we created the concept of membership to encourage that. In order to be a member of LPI, having the certification is not enough. You also have to sign on to our code of conduct. And in order to keep your status alive, you need to participate in professional development activities, which go to something called PDUs, professional development units, that help maintain your status. And I won't go into that in detail. We've covered that in other webinars that we can point to. But the main purpose of talking about them is that the concept of membership is to emphasize the fact that the technical skills are not enough. To be a member of LPI means signing on to an ethical standard, and it means committing to ongoing professional development. That's designed by LPI to try and bring out the best in the people working in open source. And so I'll turn a little bit to the code of conduct, um, which I know fairly intimately. It started as simply being a requirement of membership, as I mentioned, but we're now expanding it so that as we sign on new partners and we sign on new people involved in our community, we expect it of them. We expect it of our incoming board directors. We expect it of people that are working with us. We don't consider it onerous, but it was designed specifically. LPI created its own code of conduct because we found that none of the others that we saw were able to combine all the different things that we thought were part of what makes a good ethical code. And by that, there's a lot of good codes of conduct out there, but they don't make any allowances for open source projects or communities. Likewise, the codes of conduct for open source communities don't talk much about business ethics or conflicts of interest or things like that. So the code of conduct at LPI, which is under that URL, lpi.org/conduct, is a fairly succinct, it's a short document that very clearly goes into the kind of behavior that we hope our open source professionals will and will not engage in. And so just a little bit of going over these. There's 4 components of the code of conduct, and they each cover a different field. We want to encourage the people working with open source, the people in our community, to consider the world around them, to consider that we're trying to advance the cause of open source. We don't want to engage in anything that is going to cause people to mistrust open source or mistrust the people working with open source. So when you're out there, you're not necessarily an advocate for open source, but in your world working with open source and telling people it's a good idea, you're sort of helping to represent that. And as such, this part of the code is just saying you disclose your conflicts of interest, that you try and use open source software where you can, and that you just try and support the integrity of the open source community and don't do anything to deliberately harm it. Then we go beyond the broader global open source world and talk about personal integrity. And so that simply means that, you know, you're a good person in your business interactions. You don't shaft people. If you're trying to get a job, that we ask that as an ethical issue, you don't misrepresent your skills. That if you're over your head in something, you should be disclosing that. And that also you respect the creative rights of others. And that means that we are not for piracy. Piracy actually works against promoting open source, because open source is an alternative to conventional approaches to proprietary intellectual property. But this is working totally within the law and within what people want. So if somebody wants to release their software as open source, that's great. And we want to advocate it and we want to use it. And if somebody doesn't, you still honor that. You still honor the patents and copyrights and intellectual property of others. Simply because we don't agree with a lot of proprietary issues in working with software. If that's what somebody wants, the right thing to do is to respect that in others, because we want them to respect that in us. And lastly, issues of confidentiality and privacy. You'd think it was an obvious thing, but it belongs in our code in a sense that we asked, you know, don't get into gossip. You're being a professional out there. Don't talk crap about other people. Respect trade secrets, which is a little different from intellectual property. You know, if you sign an agreement, keep to the agreement. And most importantly, if a contract that you're about to do requires that you disclose information of where you've worked somewhere else, you really should be turning that down. If you get a job simply because of secret information that you know from somewhere else, that's a bad gig, and that's one that people should be declining. And lastly, and this is the part that has to deal with working in an open source environment, it means showing respect for the people you're working with, not being an asshole, being inclusive, not doing things deliberately to keep people away. Not everyone may be as assertive in a group as you, and it's reasonable to welcome newcomers and to seek out the ideas of those people in the back of the virtual room that never seem to speak up because they're always being, I won't say bullied, but they're sort of being overpowered by the assertive people in the room. And very often they've got some of the best ideas, but you got to give them room to talk. You got to give them room to express themselves. And so that's all a matter of showing respect for people. And this isn't just a matter of not being bad, but it's also goes a little bit beyond that to try and go out of your way to be inclusive, to be welcoming, because that kind of behavior is only going to help the work of your project. It's going to help the work of your team working with you, and that inevitably benefits you as well. And so that's an overview of the code of conduct of the 4 components. The details of that are in the URL, but like I said, it's not a long document, and so it isn't really hard to parse. And so just to go over, just to summarize on why we've done this. We wanted to do this to encourage ethical behavior, to encourage professional development. We're doing that because we want to elevate the profession. We want society to treat computer professionals and open source professionals the same way as they treat other professions in society, be they nurses, engineers, in a legal profession or elsewhere. Professionals working in IT and with computers, it's still a profession. And in order to do that, we're trying to elevate that by bringing the sort of ethical standards that exist in these other professions. The end goal of this is to build public trust, to improve our community. And as we improve the community, we're improving the people that work with it, including you. And so all of this has the greatest goal, which is growing the world of open source software even further. That increases the world's use of what I consider to be ethical software. It increases your career opportunities, and I generally think it makes the world better for all of us. And on that, I will thank you. And Caitlin, if there's any Q&A, I'm happy to take that now.
Wonderful presentation, Evan. Thank you so much for pulling that together for us. We don't have any questions in the queue as of right now, but if anyone does have questions, please feel free to add them into the Q&A or the chat box.
I mean, this is an issue that is not very commonly spoken about in open source circles. There have been some high-profile cases where there have been people that have turned away others, or people that have left various communities because they haven't been made to feel welcome, or in fact they've been actively put down. This is the kind of thing we're actively trying to discourage by encouraging a sense of, be a decent person, is the way to wrap this all up. And I think most people have a good internal sense of what's right and what's wrong and what's a good way to treat people. And it simply means being conscious of this when you're working in that chat group, when you're participating in that coding community, and when you're in a professional environment working with your co-workers or contractors. It all goes together into complementing your technical skills, and to essentially making you better and making the community better as part of that.
Thanks so much, Evan. No questions. I think you've answered them all in your presentation, so thank you. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you for joining us. I will be sending around the presentation slides and the recording and contact information. So if you do have any follow-up questions or you need clarification, anything, please let myself or Evan know. But thank you all so much for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of your day.